Well, sir, could you tell us about this car by chance?
Well, it's a 1960 Chevy Impala.
Woo, sporty.
I think it would be a perfect getaway car for Thelma and Louise on a road trip.
We could take this on quilt shows.
Yeah, did you see the room in the trunk?
Ooh, we could even haul a fish house.
And it's got a really big motor.
Yes. Can it do burnouts?
It can do burnouts both in reverse and forward.
Wow.
Yes.
What can
It's
we take?
equipped with power steering.
It is.
Ooh,
Just my kind of
that's
car.
an upgrade from Myrtle.
Dual
Oh,
antennas too.
It's a little shinier than Myrtle too. It's pretty
Fancy.
sporty.
It is pretty
We might
sporty.
not have the cop following us because we have a creeper van if we drive something like this. What do you think,
We
Louise?
just take a look underneath the hood. Look at all that chrome, girls.
Ooh.
Wow.
Oh, that might be too fancy for us,
Louise,
Thelma.
I can see you.
Thelma, it might be too... Ooh, my lipstick.
Nice. So, you think we could take her for a drive, Vito?
I think you need to take her for a drive. She's warmed up. I think it's ready to go.
All right, then.
Hang on.
Are you ready, Louise?
Fire this bad boy up! I like it. Let's take her for a spin. This is pretty sporty. Me likey, me likey.
Back up.
Killing a little grass in our
What do you
orchard.
think about this, Louise? You think we could sport this?
Oh,
on a
I
quilt show?
think so. I think so. Oh, fancy. Gas her up here, Thelma. Let's see what she's got. Woo, woo. I like it. Look at all the room. Heck, we could plug a quilting machine in here.
They
Yes.
have arrived.
We think we could make this work.
We'll take it.
So, check out the trunk.
Yeah, let's see
I
what
think
she's
this is
got.
a perfect car for vintage quilts, don't you think?
I would say so. They're going to be as spiffy as this thing.
Absolutely they are.
What's in there?
Well,
Do you think that he's storing quilts in there?
Not sure.
Can you get the key?
The other way. Turn it around.
Oh, there she goes.
I'm
You can
kind
do
of
it, Thelma. I believe in
missing
you.
my automatic button opener thingamajiggy.
Okay.
Let's
Oh.
check her out.
Just look at those
Woo!
fins, Louise.
They're very,
Nice
very,
tire
very
in here.
nice. And look,
Why, you could crawl in there and
Quilts.
sleep, especially with all those old quilts.
absolutely.
Should we take a look at those?
Yes.
Well, this first quilt that we're going to show you is actually a family heirloom. This belonged to the handyman. His grandma and grandpa made it. And we wanted to show you how beautiful a quilt can be just with half square triangles. And if you'll notice, this quilt is tied like most of the quilts were back in the day. A very utilitarian quilt. And I love these old quilts because of the story that they would tell. If you only knew where all of that fabric came from. Back in the day, most of the time, people's old quilts, the scraps that were left over from clothing were what made these quilts, along with feed sacks and that type of thing. So let's take a look at another one. This quilt came from an auction, and it's just a piece of fabric that they tied together. It has a wool bat in it. You can tell that it's very old when you take a look at the back. And they tried to be cheery with their hot pink and blue ties that they did. This quilt also came from an auction. Once again, it's tied. But the reason it came home with me was because it is a crazy quilt, which is one of my favorite kinds of quilts. And we never have really figured out, this has to be done by hand, but those stitches are all very, very perfect. And if you look at the back, you'll see that that stitching didn't come through to the back. So they stitched the top of the quilt, put it together, and tied it. The ties are on the back side of the quilt. This next one you better talk about, Louise.
So I love hexagons, but I don't have the patience to make a full-size quilt. But much like my parents, I enjoy going antiquing, and so this came out of an antique shop. This is my kind of project. It's already sewn together, and much like everything else we've seen, this has been tied.
And a lot of vintage fabric in that quilt as well, Louise.
It's kind of fun. Some of the fabrics that we've looked at in here, we've actually seen very similar prints come into the shop on newer bolts of fabric.
And no binding, they just roll the edges together and sew it down. This quilt came out of an antique shop in Alexandria not so terribly long ago, and it's a trip around the world quilt. This has been machine quilted, which I found to be very interesting, and it's a scalloped design.
And if you look at it, they made do with what they had because the person who sewed it together did run out of some of the matching fabrics, but they finished it with what they had.
And I may never ever end up making a trip around the world, so this might be my one and only.
You could take the Impala.
We could!
Woo! So when we were in Watertown this past October, we were at a quilt show, and there was a lovely lady there selling some of her vintage treasures, including this. And of course, I have no desire to make a grandmother's flower garden. I appreciate them. And her sons did not want this, and so it came home with me. I was intrigued by the edges that were done on this. It's not a straight edge, and everything here too has been hand quilted. And it's kind of cool because they echoed the hexagons that are in the back. Tiny, tiny little hexagons, which is kind of fun.
And then notice those edges, how top and bottom are straight, sides. It's a very unique design. It followed the flower garden pattern.
And I'm glad that I got to have her family heirloom in my home.
How about this one, Louise?
So when we were up in Alec for an ATA shoot that we weren't participating in, we happened across this lovely double wedding ring quilt, which again, I don't have the patience to make, but this thing had to come home with me. And so not only was it in really good condition, but it was the quilting that really intrigued me. Whoever put this together spent a ton of time and was very thoughtful with cross-hatching in the centers. They echoed every little piece that's here. They did a design in the middle of here, and then they did little scallops on the outer edge to echo everything out. There were tons of quilting in here, which was kind of fun to see.
And this peach accent is quite unique in this quilt. It's very, very pretty. That was a treasure.
It was.
Another hexagon quilt.
And from the same antique store came this quilt top, and you're going to notice not only is it not finished, but it's not very symmetrical either.
It almost looks like it hung on the line and maybe the dog or the cat got a hold
Grabbed
of
a hold
it.
of it and ate it. But there too, it's just really fun to see all of the old vintage fabrics that's in here. And it again is something that I would never do, and so it's fun to save it from being cut up, because unfortunately when we've been out and about, we've seen some stuff that's just been cut up, and we feel like we have to rescue the treasures. After all, the Impala's got a big trunk. We can store all sorts of treasures in here. Think of the auctions and the antique stores we could hit up.
I think the Impala's been rescued.
Next, what do we have here?
I love Drunkard's Paths, and I have made some of these, but I cheat. And I don't curve piece mine, so this too was rescued from an antique store. And it simply was purchased because I love the design, and the quilting in here too is kind of fun. The whole thing has been hand quilted, and obviously very much enjoyed because it's got its quirks, which makes the quilt kind of special. Yep, kind of fun.
And after all, when we make the quilts, they are to be enjoyed, loved, and loved even if they're ragged.
Oh, this is one of my favorites.
I actually bought this quilt for the pattern, and it's hung on a banister railing, and I have not made a pattern out of it, but I had never seen a quilt pattern quite like this before, so it too had to go home. It's always fun when you make a quilt if you've got the original that the pattern came off of and the old quilt, to look at it and see how different it looks from today to yesteryear. Speaking of that, Louise, do you have a vintage quilt that you reproduced lately?
I do, so we're really excited to announce that last week we sent a box off to Iowa. It is going to American Patchwork and Quilting. A couple years ago, back when I purchased the stuff from Alec, I also purchased a quilt that we've dubbed the Wheels quilt. And my wheels will be published in October.
Yes.
And so not only was the today's version, but the yesteryear's version will both be featured in their October publication, and we're really excited.
I'm so excited for you. Congratulations, Louise, and it was a beautiful quilt.
Thank you.
Another grandmother's flower
So
garden.
every once in a while, when you're out at an antique store, you see just a tiny corner of something. And of course, when it's a quilt, we have to look at it. And then you see the price tag on it and think, huh, this can't be very big. And then in the middle of the aisle, you clear things out of the way and you look at it and you realize that you just hit the jackpot, minus the gaudy edges that were put on this thing and the really ugly bed sheet on the back, which someday is going to come off because it doesn't fit the quilt at all. But this lovely gem was also an antique store find. It's a big one.
And it would have been considered a summer quilt because there's no batting in there.
This was tied, and it's tied kind of funny. Most of the time you see the ties either in the flower centers or somewhere in the pathway. And whoever made this decided to anchor the outer edges of their flowers.
It gives it a neat look. Plus it's not real noticeable where they're at.
No. And the edge too, you'll notice on the bottom, is kind of fun. You don't see it finished off that way very often either, where they didn't finish with flowers, but they kind of started to add a border in.
Created their own pattern down there. This quilt we used at Christmas time at our house. It's a red and white quilt.
One of my favorite pineapple blocks.
And it too, it was because of the red and white, I liked it. It's a very unique pattern, and one of those quilts we picked up to maybe someday replicate.
And kind of fun, you'll notice on my edge I have tone on tone, and on her edge they finished it off with the red. On the bottom they split it as they did on the top.
It's kind of fun to see that we don't always have to be matchy-matchy and symmetrical. This quilt too is from an auction. Has one of those good old wool bats in it, and yet it's colored and looks like it might be a summer quilt.
And big hand quilting rows diagonally set going through here. And you and I were trying to figure out the binding. This was kind of a unique one.
Yep. I believe they folded it over to the front and hand stitched it down.
They had a lot more patience than we do nowadays. They also probably had a little more time.
And their resources were quite different than what we have nowadays. The last quilt in the trunk. Tell us about this, Louise. This is one that you also found at a...
So last year, also in September, the following week after buying the Hexies, we were in Sioux Falls and happened upon this, which is something that I have actually looked at reproducing more than once, but I didn't have the patience to get it done, and instead I cheated and bought this. I love the colors, I love the design, and so it came home with us. It kind of has unique hand quilting of little flowers with swoops in the outer edge too, which makes it fun.
And the border quilting is beautiful in this. They've done it with light thread and they have a very distinct floral pattern in there that's very, very pretty. And a lightweight quilt, so it must have been considered a summer quilt. Well, our trunk is empty. We maybe have to take that car on the road again and do some more filling up.
I think we need to go hit antique stores. Say, did you know in Minnesota they have opened those up now?
They have.
They have. So now we should take this impala for a cruise.
Sounds good to me. Maybe we should get in it and fire it up. What are we going to talk about next week?
I think candy.
Candy sounds good to me. We hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of Thelma and Louise Vintage Style in our old cruiser car. And next time you see us on the road, you maybe want to pull over, A, to look at the car, and B, because the gear shifter is a little different than my Jeep. So, you know, if my handyman isn't right close to tell me how to do it, you maybe want to get out of my way.